Thank you all for being here. My name is Izzy Fuqua. I'm the Adult Programs Coordinator. You're here for the opening lecture for our special exhibition on the Natural Bridge in American Art. Tonight, you'll be hearing from Dr. Christopher Oliver, the exhibition curator. He'll lecture for approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll use the balance of the hour to answer your questions from the audience. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Alex.
Well, thank you, Izzy, and welcome everybody. I'm Alex Nardis, the director of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and welcome to our virtual world. And I'm happy to tell you, you are joined on this program tonight by more than 1,000 people who have registered to learn more about this exhibition that just opened on Friday. It is a splendidly beautiful exhibition. And let me just say that we are just very proud to be one of the great museums in America, the only museum, by the way, that's open 365 days a year with free general admission every day. But when I arrived at the museum nearly 15 years ago, people lamented that American art was getting second and third ratings for everything. It wasn't given the prominence. And quite frankly, I was surprised as the first English colony and obviously part of America from the very beginning. It was hard to imagine. And with the stellar collections that we have only been made better, of course, by the fabulous collection gifted to us by Jim and Fran McLaughlin. But with this legacy, I promised all of our great American patrons, collectors, and people that loved American art that we would change that around. We'd make a difference. And I can tell you, we have. We have with our acquisitions, we have with our exhibitions, and of course, the program tonight is going to give you the insight into that. This exhibition has been made possible by a host of very generous sponsors that you see on the screen here. The Letty Pate Whitehead Evans Exhibition Fund, Birch Douglas, our fabulous council, the Hoffheimers, Helen Buck, M.L. Coolidge, and the E.B. Duff Charitable Trust. And we are thankful for all of the exhibition sponsors and also the support of the Terra Foundation and the marketing support of the Charles G. Thalheimer Fund. Now, I'm happy to say that I have had one of the best colleagues one could ask for to promote the world of American art with Chris Oliver. Chris came to the museum more than 8 years ago. In the meantime, he's also married. His wife, Lizzie, works over at Viz Arts, and they have a charming little one-year-old. In his spare time, what he has been doing has been extraordinary, working on a variety of exhibitions and then working on great acquisitions. His scholarship is fabulous. He's a graduate of the University of Richmond, and then he's a two-time graduate of the University of Virginia in art history, obviously, both a master's degree and his PhD. Now, Chris has labored long on this exhibition, of course, a labor of love, and it's an exhibition that is truly the epitome of what Virginia is about. As you probably know, Natural Bridge was owned at one time by Thomas Jefferson. It's the quintessential American landmark. In fact, in its time, as you'll hear from Chris, was a landmark thought up in the same world as Niagara Falls. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Chris Oliver to talk about his new exhibition.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for that very generous introduction. I'm so pleased that all of you could join us this evening. While we'd love to be having everyone in Cheek Theater, though it would take multiple Cheek Theaters to hold everyone this evening, I'm glad that this virtual program can still exist. And I know we're reaching out across the country, not only to our beloved friends and family at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, but we have friends of the Natural Bridge joining us, as well as certain groups associated with the institutions that have lent works of art to the exhibition. So I hope to do right by all of our audiences here tonight. Well, as Alex and Izzy mentioned, what I will talk about tonight is the exhibition Virginia Arcadia, the Natural Bridge in American Art, which just opened to our membership today. and tomorrow will be public to anyone that wishes to come, all the way until August 1st. What I'll do tonight, just to give you a little sense of structure, is I'll go through the exhibition, hitting some of the major works, some of my favorites in the exhibition. I'm not able to cover all of the works as we have such a limited time, but then also to take a deep dive into several of the really major works that are featured in this exhibition. I hope that many of you have come with curious minds and will ask questions, which Izzy will be able to relay to me at the end of the program. So let's start at the beginning, as we often want to say, and think about this exhibition from the bird's eye perspective that David Johnson has given us here of the Natural Bridge in his 1861 painting. The Natural Bridge was formed hundreds of millions of years ago. It's the last remnant of the roof of an ancient underground cave, most of which has collapsed, leaving that span that it has caused so much wonder for people and artists in this that we'll be exploring in this exhibition. The title, I've been asked about the title a couple times, Virginia Arcadia, and what exactly I meant when we selected that title. Well, I love that it's playful. It has a nice lyrical sound to it, I think. And I love that Virginia, V, Arcadia, A, V-A, Virginia. That's I think, a fun aspect to it. But the idea of the Arcadian vision is something that's so prominent in 18th and 19th American as well as European landscape painting. And what I think I want to explore today in this talk is how the Arcadian vision of the Natural Bridge, that is the vision that is both of a certain place at a certain time and also out of time, I should say, results in much of the artwork that we'll see today. So the Natural Bridge, is so persistent. It is so old. It seems to have never changed. And yet we see these artists approach it in so many different ways. For David Johnson here in 1861, we see the ancient majesty of the bridge, but also combined at left with the taverns and stables that are facilitating its burgeoning tourist industry. So it's that push and pull, that tension between the eternal and the specific, the momentary, that I think I find so interesting about many of the works in the exhibition. And I think that's what many of the artists are also pushing and pulling against in the creation of their canvases, prints, drawings, and otherwise. As Alex mentioned, the site has a very specific history with its associations with many figures of American history that we'll discuss. But let's just orient everyone to begin with. Not everyone I know has been to the Natural Bridge. My main knowledge of the bridge before coming to VMFA was through the art that we'll see today. So the Natural Bridge is situated in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. I've kind of added a rough location here onto this map. I know it's not precise, but you can see where it is in relationship to cities like Charlottesville and Richmond. It is, as I said, hundreds of millions of years old. While the very first object in this exhibition is from 1775, and the last object in the exhibition, the most recently created object, is from 1930. The Natural Bridge, I think it is very important to point out, has a much longer history that precedes much of European contact with the bridge in Virginia, both colonial and then under the United States. It's important, I think, for us to recognize that it is part of the land that's the ancestral home of the Monacan Indian nation. They're an Eastern Siouan-speaking people who continue to research the bridge to this day as an important cultural location. At Jamestown, many of the English colonists encountered the Algonquin-speaking Powhatan Confederacy, and I find it interesting that it is here in Richmond, at the fall line, that it is that point between the Monacan and Powhatan where there was that point of contact. So with that awareness that there is a very significant Native history and tradition that incorporates the Natural Bridge that continues to this day, I think we can keep that in mind as we look at depictions of Native Americans in much of this art, as well as that art which may exclude them. Well, I mentioned that first object of the exhibition, at least chronologically, and that's this 1775 sixth edition of an original 1753 map of the most inhabited parts of Virginia. This was a map created by two cartographers, surveyors, Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson. That second name may sound familiar, and it is important because Peter is the father of Thomas, the eventual owner of the bridge. The impetus for this project, this amazing, what is often lauded as the most historic or most accurate historic map of the colony of Virginia was that the English government wanted a more precise layout of what the English colony looked like. And it was Jefferson and Fry who were tasked to really specifically think about the tidewater and eastern sections of Virginia, but also include the western wilderness, unsettled extremes of the colony. For much of these western extremes that Fry and Jefferson didn't actually survey, they relied on oral and written histories, specifically from those people who lived or explored those lands. And so that's why at the site of the Natural Bridge, which is indicated here by this star, we see not an indication of the geological formation, but the name at the center of this detail, John Peter Sally. Sally was a German immigrant who had settled in Virginia, and in 1742, he and a band of men were hired by the colonial legislature to explore even farther west of Virginia's colonial claims. Remember, the colony of Virginia, its claims at least, extended as far west as the Mississippi. And the legislature was worried about French encroachment upon these lands. And so to sum up a very long story very quickly, Sally spent several years on this journey. He set off with this band of men going north to the Ohio River, sailing down the Ohio River to the Mississippi, where they were captured by the French, imprisoned in New Orleans, tried to escape a few times, eventually did, and made it to Charleston, South Carolina, an English colony, from which he was able to return to his home in Virginia. And so it's likely that Jefferson and Fry learned from Sally of what that Western landscape looks like. But what's interesting to me is that when this map, the original design for this map, is sent back to London to be engraved, they include with it a story, a handwritten story of Sally's exploits, noting prominently the fact that this huge Western expedition all began with the performance of a Christian mass at the Natural Bridge. For me, I think this sets off right from the tone, a theme that the beginning, a theme that we'll be repeating several times. And that's the Natural Bridge as an emblem and embarkation point for Western exploration. It's something that I do not think would have been lost on Peter's son, Thomas. And I think it's likely that Thomas would have first learned of the Natural Bridge, perhaps from his father. He doesn't visit the Natural Bridge till 1763. But in one of the most remarkable real estate transactions that I can imagine, Thomas Jefferson, purchases from the English crown in 1774 the tract of land containing and surrounding the Natural Bridge. That has to be such a remarkable transaction. It's 2 years before he pens the Declaration of Independence. He secured the Natural Bridge as his own property. Could be the National Bridge. I think part of Jefferson's effort is to make it a national icon in the landscape. So the first image that appears of the Natural Bridge appears in Paris in 1786. We're showing you a 1787 English translation of that first publication. And that publication is the travelogue of the Marquis de Chastellux, a French military officer who served at the Battle of Yorktown. He was familiar with, of course, the French generals, but also specifically with General Washington. And so after the British surrender, the French army encamps in Williamsburg for the winter, and Chastellux himself travels even farther west to Monticello to meet with Jefferson. Of course, Jefferson recommends that he visit his new property at the Natural Bridge, and the Marquis de Chastellux is so overwhelmed by it that he orders his military engineer, the Baron de Turpin, to create the drawings from which these engravings, the first images, Western images of the Natural Bridge that we see. It's interesting to me that while the third image at bottom right is wholly appropriate for a military engineer, he had enough savoir-faire, enough understanding of the artistic principles that the top two images really are kind of put in an artistic, picturesque language that seems very familiar, even from fine art engravings. When this appeared in Paris in 1786, Jefferson was no longer at Monticello, but rather he was himself in Paris. He had gone from being formerly the governor of Virginia to now being the minister to France. He also, of course, was engaged in a publication that would promote the Natural Bridge. That publication was, as he was writing at this time, the Notes on the State of Virginia, fully published in 1787. In this long discourse about the politics and social life and geology and geography of Virginia, he of course takes several instances to stop and extol the Natural Bridge. Writing about the Natural Bridge, he says, "It is the most sublime of nature's works, so beautiful in arch, so elevated, so light and springy as it were up to heaven. The rapture of the spectator is really indescribable. It's not the only venue where he extolled the virtues of the natural bridge, and his very publicized affinity for the English artist Mariah Causeway. Prior to her departure for England from France, they had been kind of touring partners and visiting artistic sites throughout the country. He writes her this very famous, what is called the head and the heart letter. That is a letter that's a conversation between his rational and irrational sides. His rational side asking, how would you possibly get Mariah Causeway to come to America? Well, perhaps I can offer her the ability to paint the nation's most iconic scenes. He writes, she only wants subjects worthy of immortality to render her pencil immortal. The falling spring, the cascade of Niagara, one subject. The passage of the Potomac through the Blue Mountains, second subject, and the natural bridge, the third. It is worth a voyage across the Atlantic to see these objects, much more to paint and make them, and thereby ourselves known to all ages. And so Jefferson, as we explore in this exhibition, becomes really the first and major proponent not only of the natural bridge, but to set its importance by rhetorically pairing it with Niagara Falls. Of course, the passage of the Potomac referenced here, and which we will return to, is more commonly known today as Harper's Ferry. But these two Virginia landscapes can balance the northern Niagara Falls in majesty and beauty, and of course, a nice little self-promotion for Jefferson's own real estate. And so he begins this in other ways. When he returns to the United States, he's, of course, serves in the Washington administration and then becomes the nation's third president. And it's while he's president of the United States during his second term that he is given two oil paintings by the Virginia artist William Roberts. These oil paintings, one of the Natural Bridge and one of Harper's Ferry, are now lost. That is the original that were given to Jefferson. However, lucky for us, at left, we have an engraving, or rather an aquatent with engraving that was made after Roberts' painting, as well as Roberts also made a watercolor that is in the collection of the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts that relates to that original oil painting. So these two paintings were placed at Monticello in a very prominent spot. We know that Jefferson was an inveterate collector and a type of curator, and that the display of art at Monticello tended to have very specific meanings that spoke to Jefferson as a person, as well as to his idea of this new nation. So the dining room, this kind of most formal of entertaining spaces, is dominated by a large pedimented window. And Jefferson, we think, placed at one side of that window the Natural Bridge and Harper's Ferry. And in an emulation of how he wrote to Mariah Causeway, how he promoted the Natural Bridge and Harper's Ferry as some of the most iconic national landscapes, he paired them with two views of Niagara Falls. These are two works. These are not the engravings in the exhibition that Jefferson actually owned, but are engravings that are from that same edition. Two reproductive engravings after John Vanderlyn's view of Niagara Falls that were published in 1804 in London. Now, I think there's also another text or subtext that could be going on here with this display that I'm very much intrigued by, and that is Jefferson as political patron of the arts. So William Roberts, who we just saw, was the Virginian-born landscape painter. Well, John Vanderlyn very famously becomes the first American painter to go train in Paris rather than London. And that was under the patronage of his political patron, Aaron Burr. Burr, who by this point is being kicked off Jefferson's presidential ticket, nonetheless pays for Vanderlyn to be educated in France, encourages Vanderlyn to paint the Niagara Falls upon his return to the United States, and then he further encourages him to return to Paris with the canvases, even when the second one is still incomplete, display them there and have them engraved in London. I have to wonder whether this pairing, this twinning between northern and southern sites, one with a cascade of water going over it, one with a cascade of water going through it, whether it's through the Blue Ridge Mountains or through the Natural Bridge itself, is also further amplified by this dueling twinning between Jefferson and Burr himself. We know that Jefferson seems to have very slyly done that with other American politicians elsewhere in his home. So I'm very pleased to say that our amazing design and production team was able to reproduce this type of arrangement in the gallery itself. You'll see at left where we've constructed this faux large pedimented window to show and kind of give that sense of the display of these works of art as it may have been. And it's so appropriate that in this gallery, as you can see at right, we seem to have the larger than life figure of Thomas Jefferson himself. And that's in this remarkable painting by the artist Caleb Boyle, very little about which is known of the artist, from 1801, Thomas Jefferson of the Natural Bridge. This painting is remarkable in several different ways. It's the first painting of the Natural Bridge, 1801. It is the only image, lifetime or otherwise, from the 19th century at least, of Jefferson at the Natural Bridge. And perhaps most interestingly is that this painting, along with a second, that of John Jay by Caleb Boyle, also in the collection of Lafayette College, appears in New York City Shakespeare Gallery in March of 1801, only days after Jefferson has been inaugurated as president. At this time, the inauguration happened, but not in January, but in March. And so here, Jefferson, having just become the first president from an opposition party, the Democratic Republican Party, his image, his larger than life portrait is here paired with the pendant painting of the Federalist statesman John Jay. Jay has largely retired from politics at this life. And in fact, he's shown here with the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolutionary War under his right hand, perhaps at that time what was considered his most notable accomplishment. But what we also see here, and what is also so fascinating about this painting of Jefferson, is that is the break between parties and image creation, right? So John Jay's portrait is wholly in the tradition of the most famous Federalist and first president, George Washington, how he appeared in the famous Lansdowne portrait. You know, you have the monumental columns, the red drapery, the ornate Rococo and furniture, all of which seems to indicate the trappings of the halls of government. Whereas Jefferson himself is seen as his image, in the carefully crafted image that he projected for himself. Here he's eschewing all of those trappings. He is a gentleman farmer type figure, erudite though in his appreciation of the landscape, here in kind of the hinterlands of the nation, in the wildernesses of Virginia at the Natural Bridge. Now, Boyle, if he ever saw Jefferson, I would have to assume it was from very far away. The portrait of Jefferson, the figure is from an engraving after a Rembrandt Peale painting. And in the exhibition, you can see an Isaac Weld 1799 print from which I believe Boyle is deriving his depiction of the Natural Bridge, how it appeared. Well, Roberts was probably the first major or important American artist to visit the Natural Bridge and paint it, but he wouldn't be the last. We're so pleased in this exhibition to bring together the pair of the counterpart to a painting that is already in VMFA's collection by Joshua Shaw that shows these two views of the Natural Bridge. Shaw is an English-born artist. He settles in Philadelphia, and he travels the country amassing these views of the United States that he hopes to have engraved into a portfolio, which he will then sell as views, picturesque views, and make a great fortune off of these. He does produce a few of these portfolios. However, the Natural Bridge views that he paints around 1820 after his visit of that same year do not appear in the print form. And so these are remarkable works. And VMFA perhaps is my favorite, one of my favorites in the whole show. And it was a huge impetus in why I decided to embark upon this exhibition. What I find, and why I find it so interesting, why I love it so much, is because Shaw is not only painting the landscape here, the Natural Bridge at left, from by the Cedar Creek, at the base of the creek, but also at right in VMFA's work from the top of the bridge, looking down into the Shenandoah Valley. You can see a single figure dressed all in black, creeping to the edge, peeping over, looking down at what must have been a very frightening sight. Well, Shaw is smartly doing his research when he's visiting these sites, and he knows about Thomas Jefferson's writings in the Notes on the State of Virginia. Jefferson's still alive at this point. And Jefferson writes in Notes on the State of Virginia how few men have the resolution to walk to the edge of this bridge, and that Jefferson, describing his own experience, quote, "You involuntarily fall on your hands, creep to the parapet and peep over it. Looking down from this height about a minute gave me a violent headache. If the view from the top be painful and intolerable, then that from below is delightful in an equal extreme. And so it's amazing to see Shaw channeling this in his painting. There aren't many views from the top of the Natural Bridge, and certainly none other that are so well informed in what the literature says is that experience. Jefferson dies in 1826, just before the kind of great wave of American painters visiting and painting the site, something that he adamantly hoped for. He wanted not only this to be a national American icon, but one tackled by American painters. In his effort to try and get John Trumbull to come paint the Natural Bridge, he wrote to him that he must come and see it and paint it, lest some other bungling European artist depict it yet again. So the movement, the rise of American landscape painters that we so frequently call the Hudson River School, which has its firm basis in the tradition of English Romantic painting, really rises shortly after Jefferson's death. One of the first artists to visit and do these kind of paired views that we see very frequently is the New York-based artist Jacob Caleb Ward. And what I say about these kind of paired views is that Ward, like Church later, Frederick Church, like David Johnson later, there's this practice of visiting the Natural Bridge and painting it from just below the arch at the base of the Cedar Creek, and then backing up about a third of a mile, as Church writes, and getting this distant view that sets the Natural Bridge within a landscape. And this is such a codified practice that the artist David Hunter Strother actually kind of writes it down in one of his published articles. But yet Jefferson's legacies live on. We'll be revisiting Jefferson's legacies a few times through this. This pairing of Natural Bridge and Niagara is very well represented in the work of the Quaker minister and painter Edward Hicks. Hicks is probably most well known for his 60+ paintings called the Peaceable Kingdoms. They take a quotation from the book of Isaiah about divine grace allowing for the peaceful cohabitation of not only mankind, but also animal kind, and using that image of the lamb lying down with the lion as that sense of peacefulness gained through faith. And in several works, Hicks includes an image of the Natural Bridge as a sign of kind of divine approbation over the American landscape that gives this sense of peace and of divine blessing on this new land. Now, Hicks never visited the Natural Bridge. He gets his depiction from a map, an 1822 map by Henry Tanner of North America, in which the Natural Bridge is, of course, paired with Niagara in a single image. And he's kind of disassociated it. Here you have that single image, and then you see how the Natural Bridge at the left and Niagara Falls at right, with a single gnarly tree separating the two. And in both canvases here, the Peaceable Kingdom and the Falls of Niagara, you see that gnarly tree appear both as Hicks has repeated it twice. I should also point out that in the Peaceable Kingdom, Hicks places below the Natural Bridge an incongruous scene of William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania's treaty with the native Lenape Indians. This was something that was important to Hicks to promote the peaceful coexistence within his home of Pennsylvania itself. And despite the fact that Natural Bridge was hundreds and hundreds of miles away, its inclusion could be justified here because, again, it gave that sense of divine blessing upon not only this act, but of the faithful within this new landscape. I'll pause a minute from our brisk walk through painting to think about the decorative arts, because they play a large role in this exhibition. And you'll see a very dramatic installation of some wallpaper made by the French firm Zuber et Cie from 1834. Here I'm showing you two views from their views of North America that, of course, at left show you the Natural Bridge and its beautiful high arch flowing right into the horseshoe arch of Niagara Falls. This pairing yet again showing up here in the French firm of Zuber. I think these two sites were, of course, iconic, important sites that would have been known in France. We have Jefferson and Chastellux promoting them 50 years earlier. but also in 1834, when this wallpaper debuts and is awarded by a gold medal at an exposition by the French King Louis Philippe. The inclusion of these sites might also relate to the fact that they were on the itinerary of the exiled Louis Philippe and his brother when they spent time in the United States during the French Revolution. It was on George Washington's own recommendation that Louis Philippe visit the Natural Bridge, and his brother, himself a painter, painted scenes, though the Natural Bridge seems to be lost, of both sites. Again, a Jefferson-directed kind of pairing between the sites. And this is how it appears in the gallery. This is a reproduction of wallpaper, but you see it paired with some significant works of decorative arts. This was a picture I just snapped earlier today, I have to point out, with some of our first gallery visitors. So I'm pleased to see people in the space. You can see in front of each of the scene of the wallpaper, two works of decorative arts. At right, this English Staffordshire plate featuring the Natural Bridge was part of a large set that showed all sorts of different scenes of North America that, of course, also then came with a large platter itself, which had Niagara. But I'd like to take a moment to look at the chair at left. This is a remarkable, unique, amazing piece of furniture that through the course of this exhibition, we've been able to work with the Rockbridge Historical Society that owns this work and do some conservation and some study on the work to learn exactly what it was. I'll say first that we were able to bring in some furniture scholars, those who know much more about American decorative arts than I do myself, and confirm that the date of this chair is around 1820 to 25, and that it is in fact a highly desirable piece of Baltimore painted furniture. This is a so-called fancy chair where you can see the exuberance of form, this Greek classically inspired klezmos form with great gilt flourishes that is usually in Baltimore painted furniture, then set with some sort of scene that is special to the patron of the furniture. It could be a family estate or an ancestral home in Europe. And here it is the Natural Bridge. And secondly, we were so pleased to work with the conservators here in BMFA's conservation lab and just do a remarkable cleaning. The top image it's perhaps a little misleading. It maybe wasn't quite that dark, but that's just my cell phone picture from when I visited the chair quite a while ago. And you can see what a remarkable job just a cleaning can do and bringing out the original kind of brightly festooned colored, what I'm calling Pompeian red in a classical nod. Color of the chair, which would be wholly appropriate for something that's classically inspired from the 1820s. Well, let's shift gears again and go back to that kind of English romantically inspired tradition of landscape painting, so-called Hudson River School. Hudson River School is often said to have been founded by the artist Thomas Cole. Now, Cole, I think, had to have been aware of the Natural Bridge, but there's no precise appearance of the Natural Bridge in any of his works. However, a year prior to Cole meeting his important patron, Daniel Wadsworth, Wadsworth creates this very petite, but very charming and quite deft depiction of the Natural Bridge in ink wash. And I wonder whether this wasn't an object that Wadsworth showed to Cole in 1826 when they first became familiar, showing him kind of the iconic scenes across the United States. Well, whatever relationship or interaction that might have happened between Wadsworth and Cole, Wadsworth continued to play an outside role in the development of American landscape painting through his patronage of Frederick Church and the ability to get Church himself to train with Thomas Cole. And Cole does paint the Natural Bridge in 1852, the result of a June 1851 visit to the Natural Bridge itself. And I'm extremely pleased to be able to say that we've reunited this painting with its original sketches that were produced on site, a generous loan from Olana, which show the artist's working method. And it's important to note that how these paintings were produced, right? They weren't in plein air. Church did not sit with his canvas at the base of the Natural Bridge. Rather, the sketches would have been worked up there, noting the precise form of the arch and all of that. But also I encourage you to look at the details at right. And you see all those numbers that had kind of that paint by number appearance. Well, Church there is noting very specifically color, tone, and vegetation. And at the bottom, you have a key that says things to remind Church of what he saw. So it's like the number 4 is dark, cold gray, and blackish. The number 5 is rich orange rust color. And all of this helped Church create this canvas back in his New York City studio after he had done his summer of traveling. The story related to this painting is that Church was offered a collection of rocks gathered by his traveling companion and patron, Cyrus Field, who collected them at the Natural Bridge, saying, "Would you like to take these back to New York so that you have a sense of color and you can accurately match them?" Church, of course, declined, but when the painting was delivered to his patron Field, of course, the colors matched precisely. Here are 2 other sketches that are included in the exhibition, and I point them out because these may have been sketches that simply never really hooked Church enough to inspire another painting. But that sketch at left gives you that view, that distant view from about 1/3 of a mile, as I mentioned earlier. And it's on the reverse of this sketch that is found this very economical, very perhaps unnoticeable sketch of a Conestoga wagon. Church likely would have seen many of these wagons plying the roads around the Natural Bridge, which was part of the so-called Great Wagon Road. The Conestoga wagon is named from its origin in Conestoga, Pennsylvania, and had these kind of unique, very steep sides that made it, along with a couple other features, very made intentionally to travel the so-called Great Wagon Road. This type of wagon wouldn't have fared as well traveling west across the Great Plains. So it's a specific image related to the Great Wagon Road. Here is another image, perhaps, that Church may or may not have been familiar from 1820 that shows such a wagon, again, mounting the arch of the Natural Bridge as it travels along. And here's that path of the so-called Great Wagon Road that passed across sometimes, but always near the Natural Bridge, that facilitated the movement and settlement of immigrants from eastern Pennsylvania down through places like Frederick, Maryland, Winchester, Virginia, down to Roanoke, Virginia, and then also further south to Winston-Salem and the Carolinas, but also with the ability to travel westward to the Wilderness Road that led into places like Tennessee and was important to the settlement of those areas. In fact, I wonder if Church is thinking about some of these details upon his visit. There are a couple curious details to consider. At bottom are the only 2 figures in the canvas. A white woman is seated, listening to an African-American figure, presumably lecture or talk about the site. His arm is raised skyward, presumably pointing towards the great arch that lies above him. But I would question why point, how could you miss it? Well, we can also consider that his pointing may not only indicate the arch of the bridge, but also a barely noticeable split rail fence that peeks through the brush atop. That split rail fence perhaps indicating the presence of an active roadway. Then, as today, there were fences and walls that facilitated traffic across the bridge while denying a viewer a look down. Church here gives you a much more petite fence, no doubt, but it's perhaps a stand-in for Drayton's covered wagon that we see crossing the bridge in that 1820 aquatint, thinking about southern and western migration, and specifically why this figure may be talking about that portion of the painting. Well, other scholars preceding me, and I agree with them, believe that Church may have been referencing in this painting a man named Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was enslaved, but eventually was able to purchase his own freedom before moving west to Lexington, Virginia, and marrying another woman who he then purchased also out of slavery. But it was as a free person that Patrick Henry came into the employ of Thomas Jefferson as the first caretaker and tour guide of the Natural Bridge, which he did from 1817 until his own death in 1831 after Jefferson's. However, contemporary sources seem to indicate that there was no knowledge, not until his 21st century, really, is there any published knowledge that Patrick Henry was not enslaved at this point in his life. Rather, he was free and in the employ of Jefferson. It's perhaps then that Frederick Church could be considering this painting as a nod to Patrick Henry, to Jefferson's own history at the site, perceived to Church as a slaver and as a keeper of enslaved individuals at this site. He wouldn't be the first person to do so. About a decade earlier, the English firm of J&F Tallis, John and Frederick Tallis, in their history and topography of the United States surrounded, which encompassed, like I said, the whole United States. But when they got to Virginia and they went to sites and they depicted sites associated with Thomas Jefferson, they surrounded each the Natural Bridge and the Virginia Capitol with scenes of slavery, enslaved workers working, toiling, as well as enslaved people being punished, brutally punished. These were sites both associated with Thomas Jefferson, and it seems that artists and writers were aware of this hypocrisy and paradox. Church himself, when traveling to the Natural Bridge, spent a decent amount of time in Virginia, having previously stayed at the plantation Shirley, where he certainly would have been around enslaved laborers. This experience recorded by the lovely little gift to the Carter family that remains in the family's collection to this day. Church himself, of course, was following in the mold of his mentor, Thomas Cole, in that a kind of subtle combination of landscape and history. That is, a painting could be a representation of contemporary landscape, but also about American history. Famously, this painting, West Rock, New Haven, is not only a view of this landscape, but also a nod to the hiding of English judges who sentenced Charles I to decapitation within its cave system. This painting specifically was acquired by Cyrus Field. Cyrus Field, the same patron of the arts, who traveled to the Natural Bridge with Frederick Church and who commissioned this painting. So I think Church, who I can expand on perhaps a little bit later in the catalog, held some pretty significant, at least at this point, anti-slavery, not really abolitionist, I don't think, but anti-slavery views. And I wonder if we can't understand this painting as a subtle indication and nod about Jefferson's presence and history. And all of this, I think, would be exacerbated by the fact that at the time of Church's visit, it is only 9 months after the passage of the Compromise of 1850, which allowed for the continued unchecked expansion in the United States, the fugitive slave law, and perhaps most important, Virginia, the kind of turning on of the faucet that made Virginia into a massive slave market, selling many of its enslaved laborers, Western and Southern, into these new markets. And can we not read perhaps this figure at bottom as a man wondering about his own future, pointing towards that symbol of Western expansion atop the Natural Bridge? Something which, of course, if you remember, John Peter Sally in 1742, using the Natural Bridge as a symbol of Western expansion. So I'm cognizant of my time, so I may have to speed up a bit. But I have to stop and point out that in 1851, the same year Church visits Natural Bridge, an amazing publication exists. Moby Dick comes out. What could that possibly have to do with Moby Dick or with Natural Bridge? Well, I have to point out that in the climax of the novel, first day of the hunt of Moby Dick, chapter 133. This can be read as really the pinnacle of the book, almost to the climax. The first time the crew has seen this massive whale breach the waters. Something that earlier Ishmael had literally said is unpaintable, that Moby Dick cannot be known through the visual arts. What does Melville use to relate to his viewers what this image is? And he writes in this passage, but soon the forepart of him slowly rose from the water. For an instant, his whole marbleized body formed a high arch like Virginia's Natural Bridge. So Melville's aware of the currency that the Natural Bridge has, the visual currency that writers all across the globe in Europe and the United States will understand that. And this fabulous, I think, image of Moby Dick from 1930 by Rockwell Kent just really encapsulates this for me. Moby Dick wasn't illustrated, weirdly, in Melville's lifetime, but I'm really struck by the similarity between the verticality of Moby Dick's body and the curvature of the spout of water with so many depictions of the Natural Bridge. And I have to think, at least at some level, Kent was aware of these in the creation of his images. David Johnson does some amazing views, perhaps. Oh man, I'll come back to these maybe in another program. John Henry Hill, at the end of the 19th century, while the Natural Bridge may not be such an iconic national landscape, especially with the introduction of Yellowstone and Yosemite as very important sites, artists continue to revisit the site with an interest in using different media. So in the exhibition, you'll see the emergence of watercolor and pastel and photography as an important media to capture the natural bridge. We're very pleased to work with our museum patron and great scholar, Denise Bethel, to try and find as early photographs as possible of the natural bridge. And so far, we're at 1858 with the image at top. This is so far what we know is the earliest photograph. The artist I want to end with is someone who I always wanted to end the exhibition with, is Michael Miley. Miley is a Lexington, Virginia photographer. He lives and works there nearly his entire life. His bread and butter is these kind of depictions, these pictures of the natural bridge. He would have sold them in his storefront, and mainly, perhaps his real market was the tourists coming through Lexington. Nonetheless, these images are incredibly technically proficient. Miley was not cutting corners. He has great pride in his work and becomes a photographic innovator himself, producing a type of early color photography. And I'm just floored by this great large carbon print at left in this great green hue. But Miley works the natural bridge for about 40 years. And you have to wonder, does your artistic inspiration quell? Does it stop? And what we were able to find in the researching of this exhibition, that for Miley, it doesn't. These images are just 2 of 4 photographs in the exhibition that come from his original glass plate negatives. They are photographs that were likely never printed in his lifetime, but were rediscovered around 1980, and these modern prints were made. And what they show is Miley working in very unorthodox methods around the natural bridge around 1890, shooting the bridge from such oblique and disconcerting angles gives you these kind of almost abstract forms that have a real interest in texture. And at left, I love this tree just creating this great diagonal line across the photographic plane. They're so unusual for the time, especially for someone working in Lexington, Virginia. But what to me it says is kind of one of the whole points of this exhibition, is that even after 30, 40 years for Miley, the natural bridge continued to be and still was a sort of artistic inspiration. It was his muse, a site for experimentation and the creation of new art. So over the 120 or so years that we've covered in this exhibition, we see how it continued to inspire. Now that's where the exhibition ends. There's an education area that perhaps I can discuss later that follows that, but I really wanted to end the exhibition around 1900. I'll just take a few minutes here because I know we're getting close to 7:30, but thinking about, during the research and writing of an exhibition, there are many tangents that come about, many things that we start to explore and are unable to, roads that may have dead ends or roads that may be too perilous to travel. And one of these research paths came to me in the form of this photograph that I found online. It's from 1971. It's by a photographer, Alex Funke, who was a photographer working for Charles Eames. Charles Eames is most famously a furniture designer, an architect, and a wonderful collaboration with his wife, Ray. We know him probably best from his chairs, many of which are around VMFA right now in use. But why would this photograph by Funke end up in the office of Charles and Ray Eames? Well, it's because in the 1970s, Ray and Charles embarked on a series of projects that used the Natural Bridge as an emblem of the United States, as an icon. Here in this book called Images of Early America, it appears right alongside like Shaker furniture and Mount Airy, as emblems of early American design. Of course, it wasn't designed, but yet here it is. They went so far as to include it in an amazing exhibition that was an internationally touring exhibition in 1975 and 76 called The World of Franklin and Jefferson. It toured Paris and Warsaw in 75 before returning for a 3-stop tour in 1976 to celebrate the bicentennial. Quite an itinerary in the US. It was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the LA County Museum of Art. Here's an installation shot from the Metropolitan Museum. Again, featuring the Natural Bridge in it, but not really explaining how much it featured in or why, other than its kind of association with Jefferson. Well, through the course of my research, and here's the catalog from that show, and a top right notice the Caleb Boyle making a reappearance, but the Natural Bridge is never really fully addressed. But in my research, I was able to start to discover that Charles, who's from St. Louis, a city that is very much kind of a hotspot for Jefferson studies because of its history with the Louisiana Purchase, had a real soft spot for Jefferson. He admitted to being kind of a Jefferson nut, was very interested in Jefferson's own history. And that got me to think even further. Well, Ames has a self-professed lifelong association or interest in Jefferson. Could that go back as far as 1947 to the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan, where he befriends the Finnish-American architect and designer Eero Saarinen? It's in 1947 that each of these artists submit a design for a new national monument that will be designed later in the century. That monument, the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial, more commonly known today as the St. Louis Arch. Now, Ames's proposal does not get past the first round, but we know it is Saarinen's that ultimately goes all the way through and becomes the monument that we know today. However, Saarinen, he's a modern architect. He is modern with a capital M, I suppose. Here he is. Look at these models and his interest in form and the drawing behind him, looking at all these different forms of how archways appear over history. And in Saarinen's own admission, he knew little of Jefferson, the Louisiana Purchase, or why this monument should be created. It was the outlet to create this pure architectural firm. So I have to wonder, in its creation, Saarinen writes that one night, Ames comes over to his house and gives him what he calls the philosophical grounding for what would become the St. Louis Arch, the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. And I have to wonder whether Ames, the professed Jefferson enthusiast, couldn't quote from notes on the state of Virginia and say to Saarinen, relate to him the story of so beautiful an arch, so elevated, so light, and springing, as it were, up to heaven. Well, that's all I have for this evening. I know I've kind of gone a little bit longer, but hopefully we have some time for some questions. Almost everyone stuck around, so that's a good sign, I think. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was wonderful. So we do have a variety of questions. I thought we'd just start with some very basic geographical or geological questions about the arch. There are questions coming in about the height, the width. Do you know those numbers offhand?
Okay, the height is definitely 215 feet high, which I believe is often promoted as taller than Niagara Falls. There are many people on this Zoom I know who know the other specifics. I believe it's 90 feet wide.
That's what I was looking up. Yeah, I was 90 feet. Yeah.
I like the quizzing when I'm right.
Exactly. Great. And do you know if the Natural Bridge is connected to any sort of range of Virginia caves that are common in that area?
Right. So I think many of us on this call know that the Shenandoah Valley is littered with caves. I remember going to Luray Caverns as a wee little boy. So I will defer that question because I truthfully do not know enough of the geological history or what is there. Of course, there is a cave system actually on the park site today, but I can't say I can authoritatively give you a good question about how it is all connected.
That's fine. That's absolutely okay.
But people here, I mean, I know there are people on this.
If someone jumps in the chat and wants to share that with everybody, that would be great. So shifting gears a little bit, we have a question from Eric Wilson from the Rockbridge Historical Society. So I'm going to paraphrase just a little bit, but he's referencing the fact that you covered a lot of canvases and art prints that are from kind of a bygone era. So let's fast forward a little bit, bring it into the present day, thinking about selfies. They're now so key and common in our society and how we capture ourselves, putting our own faces in front of the bridge and other icons like the St. Louis Arch. So any thoughts that you have on how playful but purposeful sight lines of the selfie, its inversion of the artist and other human and natural subjects, shade the sublime and picturesque traditions you've so nicely framed? For that matter, cued by your last unorthodox Miley photos, unmanned drone photography that can now figure the bridge above. Do you want to muse on that a little bit?
That is a heavy question, no doubt. I don't know if I can really answer how that may continue to interact with the picturesque and the sublime. It certainly seems to be, I mean, drone footage itself, it does seem to want to hit on that sense of sublimity. I will, however, point out that there is a section of the exhibition that is our education section that I did not get to speak about this evening. As you see, I was already running long. But in 3 cases at the end of the exhibition, we explore how the Natural Bridge has kind of permuted itself into different images and objects through the 20th and 21st century. The last of which is a case that is exclusively dedicated to the appearance of the Natural Bridge in kind of digital media. We've been able to crowdsource some images, and we will continue to crowdsource images if you're interested in submitting through the exhibition, thinking of how people continue to shape and reshape the Natural Bridge, make it their own Arcadian vision to this day. And those are shown in a very kind of elegant display that you will see when you visit in person, because you all must, right? There. I think I am at a loss as to how it may hit and bend with these ideas of the picturesque and sublime. But, you know, I think without defining specifically how those are theoretically defined, I think no doubt many of how images are constructed does seem to be almost embedded in our DNA. I mean, we probably had more images of the Natural Bridge circulated today on digital media than were produced in the 19th century. I mean, if not today, let's say a week or a month, so that I can be correct. But I mean, the profusion itself has to lead to some sort of creation of what we think of as, you know, well, this is the spot that I take a photograph at, or certain kind of standards in a way, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So a couple of questions about what's being captured in these images. People are picking up on the idea that sometimes water doesn't seem present, whereas in other depictions it is. So I think that water that we're seeing is a tributary from the James River, and it is still there, correct?
Oh, yes. I mean, Cedar Creek is still, to varying degrees, flowing. Yes. And I don't know, you know, is that our artistic intention on the inclusion or exclusion of water by the artist, or was it a dry day? I mean, we sent some of our in-house photographers and videographers to the Natural Bridge a couple months ago, and it had a few days earlier just been a torrent of rain, and they said the creek was just flowing, so much so that they hadn't thought it'd be necessary to bring audio equipment, but they wish they had, because the sound was truly rushing through that. And every time I visit, I see it as quite still. But, you know, in the images, we also see especially in some works that I didn't show today, you know, the change in nature, you know, the trees changing, things like that, you know, based on seasonal effect.
Thank you so much for tonight's talk and the overview of this new exhibition. Like you said, we hope you all can join us at the museum to see this exhibition in person. Please do see the website for COVID safety precautions that you can take before coming and how you can plan your visit. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to our audience so much.
Thank you all so much. Have a great night, great weekend.
Have a wonderful night.